I'd like to get a little bit more systematic with it. In terms of my niche for podcasts, I want to interview high performance.
Hi, and welcome to this new episode of my podcast debut, where I interview people like Andrew who are in the process of starting their podcast or early on their podcast journey. And hopefully, it inspires you also to start your podcast and to keep going with it, to grow with it. So, thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us today. Can you start with telling us a little bit more about what your podcast is about and where you're at with it?
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Alex. So I started a podcast in 2024, and I wanted to interview trailblazers, people who are sort of at peak performance in their sort of industries, in their niches, and just learn from high performers. I started with a few episodes. I'll actually be shooting my third episode tomorrow, which is going to be on sales mindset. So very excited for that one. And yeah, it's been going well.
Amazing, bro. Thanks. And I remember we had a little chat a couple of months ago also on that. And I'd love to ask you, what are your goals with this podcast?
Yeah, good question. I think just to have real conversations, to talk about things that people don't usually speak about, talk about global events, geopolitics, peak performance, neuroscience, just talk about really fun and engaging topics. And really, I think it's great to have a podcast. You can build a network. You can talk to people who ordinarily you wouldn't speak to. So yeah, this sort of stuff.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, there's many reasons you can start a podcast, right? From learning to networking to monetizing to building a brand. I'd love to ask you if we get even more specific. Do you have specific goals with your podcast?
Well, for me, the ROI isn't necessarily to monetize it. However, for me, I like to speak to really sort of interesting people at the top of their field. So I think the benefits of having a podcast, well, is really the network. I think I've always been really big on networking and meeting inspiring people and learning from the best. I've always been an avid learner with a hunger for growth and growth mindset. And I think that's how you and I initially connected all the way back in 2018.
Yeah. Yeah. Podcasting is such a really good tool for networking. I often say you can kind of go 10x. You can go like to someone who has 10 times your following and they'll usually be happy to be on your show, or someone who has 10 times your um, let's say income level with their business, for example, and they'll be happy to be on your show. So it's a great way to go to someone who is more advanced than you in any particular field, whether it's a health, performance, business, or anything that you want to connect with more. And then we know the saying, you become the average of the five people you spend the most time with. So a podcast is definitely interesting for that.
100%. And I feel that every podcast you do, you actually have some growth from it. You learn from someone else who's got different perspectives on the world. And yeah, I think if you're someone who loves personal growth, it's actually really good from that standpoint.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Andrew. I'd love to ask you like a little bit more about the format of your podcast then. How often do you want to record and publish? What platforms do you prioritize?
Yeah, look, I had a bit of a goal to sort of shoot one once every month. I didn't really stick to that schedule due to work commitments. It sort of depends. Whenever I have the capacity and I have a bit of breathing space, That's typically when I will shoot some podcasts. So I might shoot a couple in a small span of time. I'd like to get a little bit more systematic with it and implement some systems, a bit more discipline and adhere to a bit of a schedule. But I think in the future, like if there's synergy with someone and it just sort of makes sense to shoot a podcast. I don't actively go seeking for people, but if it makes sense to have a bit of a conversation, then by all means, I'll certainly entertain conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. And yeah, I can totally relate with like the systems. I mean, obviously, as it's more what I'm doing all the time now, I've gone really deep on systematizing my podcast, and that's how I can do sometimes 7 or 8 in a week, right? And also leveraging AI tools and especially Riverside, for example. But yeah, and you've probably experienced firsthand if you have like a good process with Calendly and a pre-interview form and Riverside, and then have a checklist and all this. It's actually like for me, it takes me about 2 hours per episode, basically in total, which makes it like much more manageable. And I usually recommend for people and train people to do in, let's say 3 to 4 hours per episode is good. Like this, you can do every week, really. Yeah. Um, I also find that, like many things in life, there's a power in momentum. Like when you learn something and you don't do it for a month or two, sometimes you almost need to relearn things because you lost that momentum. I'm wondering, has it been your experience also?
Yeah, good question. Look, I think when you're building momentum, it's going to be better. Whether it's like going to the gym, right? If you don't go to the gym for a couple of months and then you come back, you're a little bit dusty, a little bit rusty. Your fitness is not as good. I think like it's like all things in life, really. So yeah, maybe a little bit. I think from like the technical side of things, I've already learned quite a bit from my first two episodes. I was outsourcing the editing component, and I found someone on Fiverr, and that ended up being quite a bit of money. And then I thought, well, I need a better solution to this. So now lately I'm looking a little bit more at the automation side of things. And I think Riverside is really good for that with the AI components and all this sort of stuff.
Mm, amazing. Yeah. Yeah, it is an interesting one. I mean, for people who have a big podcast, it makes sense to have a team. And then when you're the host, you really just come and host and that's it. And then you have a team that takes care of the rest. And that can make a lot of sense. However, I find that when you're kind of in between that, it almost makes more sense now to do it yourself. So a lot of people, let's say, who are coaches who make 2 or 3 thousand a month, then like, okay, they're growing, but they're not huge. They don't have a huge team. I find it's probably better to do it yourself with an hour or two of understanding the post production, choosing your clips and all this. It's going to be more efficient money wise, but also time wise than having, yeah, someone on Fiverr that you need to train and then might not really understand fully your brand and all this. So to me, it's almost like do it yourself with AI and the right processes. And then once you're really big enough, outsource it to your team that knows your brand, does really good work, and you really trust them. And I feel like AI and those good processes, they kind of replaced someone 3 years ago who you would have needed to do decent editing and okay clips, for example.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the coaches and these people running these sort of businesses, having a podcast is great for the exposure, getting your business out there. And I think what are the stats? A lot of people actually quit, I think, after the sixth or so episode. Something like 80% of podcasts don't even make it to 10 episodes. So it's there are challenges for sure. It's effectively like running a little business.
I think I think that's the right balance to find, you know. I often ask people when they start, is it a passion project or is it more a business? But actually, it's not that black and white. Usually, it's a little bit of both. And even if you run it as a passion project, you want to treat it a little bit as a business. And even if you do it like more directly for monetization, you still want to do something you're passionate about. So it's not that black and white, but it's good to mix the two where you need to be passionate because that's going to come up with your energy. Podcasting is something that I believe should come from passion, and consistency is important. So you want to love it, but at the same time, it is important to treat it as a business also. Understand your goals, understand your processes, and that's going to make it more fun and sustainable. And I love what you share. I think it's 90% of podcasts they stop before episode 10 because they have that passion, but then they don't have the processes and they don't have results and the views they want. And then life happens and they need to make money and they don't monetize and these kind of things.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. You've got to have a combination of those soft and hard skills. You've got to understand systems and processes and data. What gets managed gets better, right? You need to have that data to be able to improve and to make changes. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. So they do have struggles and challenges for sure.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. And by the way, everyone watching here, if you have the idea of starting a podcast or you already just started and want to come on the show to talk about it, check the links in the description. And I'd love to have you on the show talk about that too. So, and thank you for watching for now. Andrew, I'd love to touch upon authenticity also because I know it's something you that's really dear to your heart when it comes to speaking online. So I also believe that authenticity is something really important in the world of today, also for the success of your podcast. So you have the more left brain processes and strategies, and then you want to have also that heart-centered authenticity, which is what's going to really be the foundation, I believe. So tell us, why is it important for you?
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's like, how do you be authentic in an inauthentic world? And I think the world that we live in is with social media, it's like, yeah, people want to connect more so than ever. So yeah, you're right. A lot of people tell me that I'm actually quite left brain dominant. I'm very logical and all this sort of stuff. You look at the two spheres of the brain. It's like that right side where it's a bit more like, yeah, nice one. And yeah, I was doing the transcendental meditation for a good number of years, particularly when I was in tech. This is very it was a great practice to mitigate stress. You know, releasing like the stress builds up, and as I've sort of progressed in tech, in sales, leadership roles, it gets increasingly hard the older you get. So the body, um, you need to have like more system, like more practices in place to be able to thrive in this world. So yeah, that's sort of where I'm at.
Not so much, no, actually, because I've
Well,
done
I think
Vipassana also
initially
since
I
then.
wasn't
I actually
really sure what my
prefer
niche was
not
going to
using a
be, what sort
mantra,
of people that I
but I
wanted to
usually sit
interview.
20 minutes though, because one
Now I have a
hour
little
is a
bit
little
more
bit hard to
clarity on my
implement. So I kind of
purpose,
do the transcendental
and
meditation, but
I think
without the mantra,
my
let's say,
career, I've got more
and
clarity
more
around my
feeling
career.
my body and
I've been
observing my
in
breath.
sales a lot of my career, but now I'm actually a bit more passionate about the leadership roles and stepping more into leadership. So building high performance teams, um, learning about high performance. So, this is why I love stuff like CrossFit, ice baths, um, breath work, all this sort of stuff. So, in terms of my niche for podcasts, I want to interview high performance, particularly in areas of business around mindset, sales mindset. I've got a couple of people now that I plan to interview, high performers at the top of their game, and just to share industry insights, to give
Nice,
people
nice, nice. I'd
insight
love to ask you
into
also,
what it takes to
so
be a
now
high
you're gonna
achiever.
shoot your third episode on the
Um,
podcast. Like, where are you at
and
with
I
it?
think a lot of these,
Do you
there's a
have
lot of
any challenges,
training from
especially
like
that you feel are ahead of
leaders
you
and
now
stuff
with the
like that, and
podcast?
just be able to share that and help mentor others is something that I'm really passionate about. I mean, for sure, it's what are they? It's all about who you know, right? They say your network eventually becomes your net worth. So, not that I'm money driven or anything like that, but I think I've always been into networking and being authentic as well. And from these sort of collaborations, I've worked with many people at many organizations, and it's certainly helped my professional career. Uh, and it just makes sense to have a podcast as you sort of grow and you evolve. Um, I'm sure that now that I'm clear on my niche, having sort of business individuals on the show can lead to potential collaboration in the future. If it organically happens, great.
You could interview people who are leaders and then attract an audience that love those interviews. But also in your case, you can directly go to leaders who are generally busy, who would maybe not have time. If you ask them, hey, can I get a cup of coffee with you? They would say no, but because you invite them on the podcast, they say yes. And then you nurture that relationship that can lead to
Yeah,
collaboration.
100%. I
How does
think
that
I
land?
was thinking about the potential ROI on having a podcast, and you would speak to people that ordinarily you wouldn't have conversations with, but as a result of having a podcast, people are way more inclined to actually be on a podcast. So as a result of that, you can end up having really good conversations, powerful conversations. You can even get mentoring in areas that you want to grow in, whether that's sort of leadership, um, neuroscience, neurophysics, high performance, peak performance, or top level sort of entrepreneurs. So yeah, absolutely, it's definitely powerful to have a podcast for sure.
Yeah, and actually, bro, I'd love to ask you. So you said you want to
Yeah,
do
that's
one
the
per
sort of
month.
goal is if I can have one a month, and if it doesn't require too, it's not too time consuming because I do have a sort of career, and if I can implement it around my career, I think if I have the right sort of systems and processes in place, I definitely would like to have a podcast for the next 10 years or so. One a week's
Why
a
not
little
one a
bit,
week?
probably a little bit too much if I'm in sort of various leadership roles, and it would be challenging. Maybe if I got to a point where I built a business and it just made sense to have more guests, that could change. I don't know. But at this point in time, one a month feels a bit more sustainable.
Okay. And I'd love to ask you if you had a podcast and you had one per week and that like brought you $5,000 a month, for example,
I
would you do
mean,
one a week?
sure, why not? I mean, if it was generating that much revenue. Um, but again, it's not my goal, is the monetization aspect of it. It's just if it happens as a result, say I build a podcast and get it to a level like Tom Billieu, something like that, or one of these people. Um, I don't know. I guess for me, it's not that big a deal. It's more about just having good conversations with interesting people. If it grows, great. That's a good thing. But at the same time, it's not my main focus. My main focus is my career, and then I like to have a podcast on the side. If that podcast grows and evolves, I don't know what's going to happen with it. It could. that would be a different story.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I'm asking you because as you're doing right now, people tend to separate the podcast and the career. And usually that's why they don't prioritize the podcast, right? Because they usually prioritize the career and they think, oh, podcast is fun, but I need to prioritize my career. But like that's why I ask you this question. It's like all of a sudden, if the podcast brings you a lot of business for your career, then you'd probably do more. So thank you everyone for joining this episode. Andrew had a little glitch there, but to wrap it up, I think to me it's important to say like for some people that might have, let's say, a lot of money and really don't prioritize monetization and they have all the freedom in the world to do a podcast when they want. I think that's fine. But for most people, if you can align your podcast with your career, with your business and monetizing and build that from the beginning, that will allow you to actually keep going with the podcast and to not separate them like this. So that's why I think in general it's important to actually think of your podcast as part of your business and as a business itself, even if you want to keep the passion part in it. So thank you so much for joining. You can like, subscribe, and share, of course, if you want to support. Tell us in the comment what you learned, if you have any questions, and I read them all. I reply to them all. So thank you, and come on the show if you want to talk about your own podcast. Much love.